Sometimes directed ads, they really hit. So on TikTok, I was given an ad to come to an open house for an architecture tour. They just knew. I don't browse architecture TikToks. I don't go anywhere like that. And whatever mysterious algorithm put it in contact with me hit the mark. It let me know that a once every few months open house at the Paul Rudolph House in New York City was coming up, and there was no way I was going to resist. So I took one of my first architectural tours, and it went pretty well. This is Jason Scott Talks His Way Out of It, a podcast about technology, history, and getting myself out of debt. Thanks to Jeff Atwood and the hundreds of other supporters on Patreon and elsewhere who have been supporting me and helping me get out of debt. I first became aware of Paul Rudolph, the architect, because I watched a documentary on Halston, the fashion creator, and it walked through all sorts of aspects of his life, from his early days doing fabric cutting to when he redesigned himself as much as his clothing to become an icon, literally an icon, for his outlook and his products. And as part of that, he bought an apartment, and the apartment was designed by Paul Rudolph for a couple in the 1960s. It was a very striking space, and in this documentary, which only showed it as much as how Halston used it for parties, you sensed this was a different kind of outlook. Among other things, the staircase had no banisters. There weren't any guardrails anywhere. It was like a intersecting set of rectangles on a couple floors inside of a large box. It was striking, it was bright, and Halston decorated it in a very specific way with images of himself and his products and art that he cared about. It was, in other words, something that stood out to me before going on to the rest of the documentary. I didn't know that Paul Rudolph was the designer for a number of years afterwards. I just thought of it as Halston's apartment, and my first thought was, I hope somebody has preserved it. Well, it sold for many millions a few years ago, and I'm assuming it sort of looks the same. It's been protected simply by its uniqueness. Obviously, I didn't go too deep on Paul Rudolph, so I didn't really check on did he have other works I should look at, where did his life go, what other examples might I find out there, and of course the question of could I ever visit one. So finding out that this most personal creation, this building he had built and that he lived in, had regular tours that you could get a ticket to was absolutely alluring. When I came to this building, now located in a very modern section of New York City, with buildings of all sorts that have sprung up around it, as well as buildings dating back to the 40s and the 30s, it is still extraordinarily striking. A set of white rectangles overlaid on each other, extending up 4 floors. You walk in, and the building is composed of a business in the basement, which is actually his own lighting business that he was running before he died and which continues to run to the modern day. And then the museum lobby, as well as a workspace, obviously being used by designers for the business in the basement. And after you buy your ticket, you take an elevator to the roof, which is simple, and then walk down floor after floor of unusual intersections of rectangles and squares, light coming in from every direction, and a sense that you are in something, if not modern to the last second, something that is out of time, out of the normal run of what we expect to tell when a building was built. I went through floor after floor, met other people who were studying it for architecture, had a lovely conversation with a few students, and ultimately bought a few architecture books that I normally would have never run into, except that they were tangentially connected to the work that Paul Rudolph did. He has a long and storied career, a huge amount of disciples who would come and visit him and talk to him. At no point should one feel that he was an obscure person who never got his due while he was alive. He clearly did. Like I.M. Pei or Frank Gehry or Frank Lloyd Wright, you could really sense Paul Rudolph did fine. This building was clearly an ongoing personal project, a workspace for him to figure out ideas. And even though it has more modern additions to make it compatible with building codes in the 21st century, you could still find his handprints everywhere in how it was put together. What you also could see was rust. There were a number of places on the outside and the inside that when you looked past the unusual and daring designs, you could see the wear. You could see where things were starting to fall apart, and that this 30-plus-year-old building was being taken care of, but clearly had some problems. There were discolorations underneath the white paint. There were holes in some of the metal work. I could sense, like a boat that was brilliant and beautiful, that it had been in the water a little bit too long. And it really brought to head for me how difficult this is. How difficult it is to keep a legacy alive, one that's subject to weather and rain and wear, not just a virtual site with a description of how things are, or a set of pages in a book explaining what the goals were, but an actual physical space, taking as many admissions as it does during its open houses, with the income from those tickets clearly being used for basic things like taxes and utilities instead of what was clearly a much-needed renovation. It brought me back to when I recently visited the FDR estate in Hyde Park, New York, where the former president had gifted his home that he had built and that he lived in with his wife, where the presidential library for FDR was available, with all of the papers and archives and events happening. That library building, it was beautiful. But if you walked over to the house and really looked at the foundation, at the steps, you could tell it was really beginning to crumble. I can't fault anybody for this situation. I don't know the finances. I don't know the priorities. All I know is that it's one thing to declare a space to be a memorial, a remembrance, a museum, an archive, but there's all of these untold additional steps that are very difficult to take, very difficult to make happen. And that perhaps that is the secret problem with all archives. It's possible to get to a certain point, achieve what needs to be achieved, but not become an endless money sink to make things look perfect, to make them exactly the same as they've always been, as if people still live in the house, as if a staff runs in and out of the doors, as if meals are cooked there, or that children are raised in it. It hasn't been that for many, many decades. And as the Paul Rudolph House continues to attest to his ideas, and parts of the building slowly, subtly come apart, I count myself very lucky that I was able to walk through its halls, feel a little bit of what was trying to be done, and walk away with a few books I would have otherwise never bought. This is Jason Scott Talks His Way Out of It. Thanks to James Bekoyanu, Ernie Hershey, Michael Rubin, David Fisher, Dileep Reddy, Sean Kelly, Trixie the Cat, Joey Mink, Martin, Symbionts, Benjamin Guts, and Anonymous, along with the hundreds of other supporters on Patreon and elsewhere who have been supporting me and helping me get out of debt. That's Paul Rudolph. Looking up Halston's apartment, looking up Paul Rudolph, you're either going to really love it or say, that's not for me. You can be quite free to feel either way.